Hey everybody, Brett Rice, Core Vision Financial Group, coming to you today with another episode in our series of financial topics. Hey, today we'd like for everybody to go out to YouTube, go to our YouTube channel and like and subscribe to our video channel. That'll just help us get you notified whenever we post a video. And it gives you an opportunity to go there and see all the videos that we have posted in the past. So today I'm going to be joined by Andrea Lee, and she's going to be acting as the host, and her and I are going to be having a conversation about target date funds. Target date funds are pretty common in employer retirement plans. So we're just going to do a little series on that today and talk about all the pros and cons and all the different aspects of target date funds. So thanks, I hope you enjoy the video.
Thanks, Brett. Today he is going to cover target date funds, what they are, how they work, and just kind of give us some information on that topic. A lot of people have familiarity with that in their employer plans, but may not know exactly kind of the details involved. So we're going to cover that. One other bit of exciting news that Brett, I don't think, mentioned. We are now today recording from our new podcast room, so I am so excited that I get to be involved in the annual premiere of that, so that's super exciting. So yeah.
I don't know how I forgot to mention that. It's probably because I'm so nervous about all this new equipment in here.
Yeah, so super fun.
Super exciting.
Yeah.
Very excited to be doing this.
All right, well, you want to go ahead and get started?
Well, look, real quick, let's just do quick introductions. I'm Brett Rice, Core Vision Financial Group, financial advisor. Been with Core Vision about 4 years. Located right here in Shelbyville. Work with clients every day on different financial needs, financial planning.
And I'm Andrea Lee. I have been with Core Vision now almost 5 years. Also a financial advisor.
All right, let's jump right into what is a target date fund.
All right, Brett Rice, what is a target date fund?
Target date fund is where you pick the date closest to when you want to retire. So a target date 2065 is you're saying, hey, my plan would be to retire around 2065. So then the portfolio in this investment is designed to, as you move through your career, the asset allocation changes. It goes from, say 80-20 stocks to bonds to in the end being like a 50-50 and you can choose different ones and how they end. There's a bunch of different technical terms we're going to get into and the different ways that target date funds work. So we're going to talk about that today, but most generally originally they were called life cycle funds. So as you move through your life cycle, it would adjust with how a traditional asset allocation should progress through a lifetime.
Okay, that seems to make sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of supposed to make sense like that, hey, you know what, as I get close to retirement, it should get more conservative. But, I mean, there are pros and cons of that, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but that's generally what they were designed to do. Because what you had people who in the 80s, when 401ks came out, they created an investment lineup, they chose those investments, and then they never messed with them again. And so then you had people that were going to retire, say around 2000, 2001, 2002, and all of a sudden you had a stock market crash. Well, these people were now 60 and not 40 and should have been more conservative. Their asset allocation should have been different. Potentially should have been different. And then what happened is they were just too aggressive for their risk tolerance at that time because they were borderline ready to retire. Market crash, well, they're still, potentially aggressively invested, and then you lose 40 or 50% of your assets, within years of wanting to retire.
Right. So and my assumption is too, on that scenario, you've got 20 years, you're not changing anything, you're also not diversifying.
Right.
And you're just growing more into more than likely growth, and then you're extremely heavy weighted growth, even for somebody who is young and wants to be aggressive, you're probably even extremely aggressive.
Yeah, your asset allocation just gets out of whack, right? Because you're not going in there and rebalancing and adding new investments and all of that stuff. You're sticking with the same, say, 3 or 4 funds you picked 1988, and then here it is 2001, and you're in a different spot, and you're in a different position in the life cycle, right? You're now, potentially kids in college, kids out of the house, you're really focused on that nest egg for retirement, but you've not changed your asset allocation. So you're just in a different spot. And so now these life cycle funds, what they do is on autopilot, they're moving through there, and in 5 or 10 year increments, they're becoming more diversified. They're becoming more like, instead of being 80-20 stocks, they're going to start moving to, 60-40, 50-50, 40-60, as they just move through those time frames, or stages, we'll call them, in life.
Okay. So what are some advantages?
Advantages, we touched on one of them earlier, and that's the autopilot. That's where somebody doesn't have to be worried, hey, 10 years from now, hey, I haven't changed my investments in 10 years. Because as these move through those time horizons, they're going to adjust automatically. Roughly it's about 5% every 5 years. They're going to start turning that dial a little bit, saying, hey, instead of being 80-20, 80% stocks, 20% bonds, now we're going to go to 75% stock, 25% bonds. And just as they move through those time horizons. And that's a huge advantage for people that have zero interest in getting involved in that. They want to make sure that their assets protected, but they don't want to be like, I don't want to spend weekends doing research on what my investments are and how I should be changing that asset. These help with that.
What are some disadvantages?
So in my personal opinion, disadvantages of these, I think that they're more conservative, I think, than the average investor. Someone who is educated and informed and participates in this management, I think they would be more aggressive than traditionally these life cycle funds are. I think they move more towards bonds faster than your person who's spending time and educating themselves and being involved in this would go. I just think that they would slow down that transition from stocks to bonds.
Okay.
Especially in today's environment. I mean, bonds are giving you no protection, right? We know given the current market state here in May of 2022, that bonds are not offering protection from the market falling because of the raising interest rates and other factors that are out there in the market, that you're just not getting that. So if you were moving your assets towards bonds, right now you're not getting the protection that traditionally you would have found in bonds.
Okay. So do these tend to be actively or passively managed?
Good question. And there are both. So actively managed is where you're paying a fund management company to spend time actively researching the investments and actively buying and selling investments inside those funds. Passively managed is where traditionally, like if you look at like an ETF for the S&P 500 or something like that, it just follows those indexes. So it's not in there, actively buying and selling stuff to try and change the scope of the investment objective. It's just following the index, or as these, it's just trying to stay at the asset allocation of 80-20, 70-30, right? So that's what they're doing. And if you get a big run up in the market or a downturn in the market, those asset allocations could potentially get out of whack. You could go from 80-20 to 75-25 without changing the investments, just based upon growth and shrinkage of those investments. So, they keep an eye on those and make sure that allocation stays where it's supposed to. But the big difference is actively they're in there doing that more frequently, and a lot of times the investment objective is what they're trying to make sure, hey, this investment is, kind of gotten out of that scope, so we need to remove it and put something else in there that keeps us at that scope.
How might a target date fund affect an overall allocation for a portfolio?
Yeah, so we had a discussion before we went on air here about how those fit into 401ks and whether their entire 401k or employer plan should just be a retirement date or a target date or whatever. And I spoke to where I use them in conjunction with other investments in there, right? You can then say, hey, well, I'm going to use it because I know it's going to take part of the portfolio and it's going to be on this glide path that's going to go from 80 to 70 to 60. But I can also then take part of the portfolio and say, hey, I want to be more aggressive. I want to go, blue chip growth or whatever that fund is, and say I want a portion in that, but I also want to protect a portion of it to where I'm going to say it's going to be on this glide path, and it's going to be on the, we already know where it's going to be in 20 years. It's going to get whatever the glide path takes it to.
So if you have a target date fund and you have other investments, you probably want to be looking at those as a whole to see if you're diversified, to see if you like what your allocation is looking like, right? Because it unless I guess you have, because if it's not your only investment, let's say you have an old 401k that's in an IRA now, that may or may not be on the same path, right? So looking at that, which also I guess makes me think of another question.
Yeah, but real quick before you go to the next
Sure.
question, let me just talk about that. I 100% agree with you. Yeah, the glide path is going to have a certain asset allocation. If you go start adding a blue chip growth or a mid cap, small cap, international, those other ones in there, it's going to change the overall portfolio's asset allocation. And you want to be aware of that, because you don't want to say, oh, I'm going to put this international, this blue chip in there, and next thing you know, you want to be 70-30, but now what you've done is made yourself 85-15 stocks to bonds, and then now you're more aggressive than you want to be. So understanding that, and a lot of these employer plans, have a website and stuff. They'll use the Fidelities, the Prudentials, those guys. And when you get in there and you do that, there will be a space that's going to tell you that, like your asset allocation. And if not, there are other ways to do that. You can go online and there are some free tools out there that you can use. I'm going to recommend that you get as educated and involved in that as you possibly can to make sure that you understand where you're going to be in that asset allocation.
So the question I thought of is, you mentioned all these different companies that offer all these target date funds. Are they all the same? Like if this is a 2065, is every 2065 going to look the same in allocation, in the way that it drops? Are they all, on the same timeline?
Yeah, I'm going to say they're not going to look identical. They're going to be a little bit of differences, right? Everybody's going to have a different makeup of those funds. Somebody, like if you get into the difference between a Vanguard, a Fidelity, BlackRock, you're going to start looking at, someone's going to have more international. Somebody's going to have, more U.S. equity. Somebody's going to have just different allocations in there. And it might be a very small percent, say under 1%. But they are going to be a little bit different, and you need to make sure that you understand. If you have options to choose between like a Vanguard or a BlackRock, which in most plans you're not going to have the option to choose between BlackRock, Fidelity.
Right.
They're just going to say, hey, we've chosen Vanguard target date funds, and then you choose from them. You just got to choose between 2065, 2060, 2055, whatever that year is closest to your desired retirement date. But in general, they're not going to be identical. They're going to be very similar. The differentiators are going to be, exactly how much U.S. or international stock is in there, how much bonds, how much of those specific investments that'll change that allocation just a little bit as far as U.S., international, or stocks. But the overall asset allocation will be similar, right? They're going to be 80-20, 70-30, so whatever those breakouts are.
Okay. What about expense on all these options?
Yeah, so the expense ratios for all of these funds are all over the place, right? You'll have some that'll be down around 0.1%, and then you're going to have some as, over 1%. So you really got to be aware of that, and that's really the difference between the actively managed, the passively managed, the mutual funds, the funds of funds, the ETFs, all those different all those different types of investment tools that they're going to use, that you need to just be aware. Hey, why am I using this one at 0.5% when there's this other one over here that's 0.25%? And really that the difference in those two, the half and the quarter, is going to be returned to you. Right? So it's important to understand that, and I think that's where you'll see a lot of funds, or a lot of employer plans will offer these funds that have lower expense ratios. If you compare them to the other investments in your employer plan, you're going to see there's pretty significant range of expense ratios.
So when looking at that, you need to be looking at not only the return but the expense, and then whatever that net is,
Correct.
comparing those numbers, right?
Yeah, I think it's you don't want to use return as the only piece of information you use to make this decision, because return doesn't tell you everything, right? And then you want to look at, like you said, expense ratios. You're going to want to understand what is the difference in the U.S. equity, the international equity, world equity, whatever, the stocks, bonds. You're going to want to at least scratch the surface on that so that you're educated and understand what is the difference in the 2060 to the 2055 to the 2050.
Right. Well, and comparing apples to apples, right? You want to make sure that you're looking at all the information the same way. And sometimes I think this just depends on the plan. Sometimes those expense ratios are, or sometimes those return numbers are already net of fee. It just kind of depends on the company and how they report it. So.
Yeah, and that's where you just got to make sure you read through that and you understand, oh, this expense ratio or this return number is net of fees, or it does, just so you know, because you don't want to pick something and then be like, that's not what I thought it was at all.
Right.
So, and I mean, when you sign up with your employer plan, they're going to have people that are resources that you can ask these questions to, people you can email, they're going to have websites you can use as resources, all that.
How would this work then? So that gets me to my goal, right? That gets me to retirement. Then what happens?
Well, so target date funds work two ways. You have a to and a through. So what the idea is, if you pick a 2060 fund, a to target date fund has that asset allocation changing to that date, and then once you hit that date, it plateaus and it stays at that asset allocation through your retirement. Whereas there's also what's called a through target date fund that, say you want to retire at 2060, it will continue changing that asset allocation past 2060. So it will almost be like technically a 2070 target date fund. So it would go another 10 years or 15 years before it plateaus and goes out there. And then in retirement, you probably got to look at these asset allocations completely different and say, hey, do I need to change this entire thing to then start generating income? Do I need to become, is the investment environment different? I mean, we don't have no idea what the investment environment is going to look like in 2025, let alone 2050 or 2055. We have no idea. So, I mean, I think a lot of it is being educated. There are a lot of great podcasts out there like this one that you should watch that will help educate you on these topics and, kind of give you, a little bit of a nudge and a direction to say, hey, you should look at this, right? We just talked about expense ratios and total return and to and through target dates. Those things that kind of start building this knowledge base for you that helps you say, hey, how do these work? Because traditionally what's going to happen is you have this target date fund in your employer plan. You're going to get to retirement and then you're going to say, okay, I'm going to move this money out of this plan, right? Or you could leave it in there, but you're going to want to change those investments. You're probably then going to want to call, the Vanguard target date or the Fidelity, T. Rowe Price, BlackRock, whoever that is, and say, hey, I want to move this out of this plan and I need to get it set in a different asset allocation. It's going to start generating revenue for me so I can live throughout my retirement and have income from that. So once you get to those, I think you've really got to sit down and, really do some thinking on, hey, should I continue on in this target date fund? Do I need to change my investment allocation? Do I need to totally change my investment objective completely? Because now I need this asset to generate income for me for the next 20, 25, 30 years. So,
well, my opinion on that is you need to, at that point, for sure involve a professional.
Absolutely.
Plan out that retirement and make sure, preferably you come to us prior to retirement, so that we can kind of say, yes, that's a good date to do so. But it happens where people show up and they're like, hey, I'm retired, so we make that work. But I do think at some point it's a good idea to involve a professional to really help you create and look at that plan to make sure it's going to work. Because nobody wants to go back to work when they're.
I think ideally right? We would be working with somebody through that life cycle.
100% agree.
And as they start approaching getting, within 10 years of that retirement date, we've got a financial plan in place. We've got a retirement. We know what about the dollar value we want that retirement asset to be at. So we know, hey, once that's done, we're going to move that into, an IRA, and then we're going to change that asset allocation, and we're going to start trying to create some income off that. So in retirement, because once you retire, you don't stop investing, right? You need that asset to continue
right
for, the rest of your life. So as you're getting there, your investment objective is going to change a little bit, right? Because now instead of, hey, I need growth, I need capital preservation, and I need income. You needed to do different things at that point. And that's where I think having, already established a relationship with a financial professional and them understanding what your goal is to that.
Right.
When you get there, you're already more comfortable with the fact, I already know what this process looks like. I already know what we're going to do. I know that we're going to change these investments. I know that we're gonna, start looking for dividends. We're gonna start looking for all these things that are gonna generate revenue so I can maintain some people are gonna live in retirement 30, 40 years.
Right. Well, and I think too, as much as everyone looks forward to and plans for retirement, I still think once you get there, that's overwhelming. That's a big adjustment, right?
Yeah.
Because your whole life, that's what you're working towards, and then one day, it's here, and so your whole life really switches, and what your focus is. And I think that I don't know, I feel like in some ways that can be kind of stressful just because of that change. And so I think knowing what to expect, at least me personally, knowing what to expect would help me not be so traumatized, if you will, from all that change.
I agree, because I've sat down, and I'm sure you've sat down with people who are like, I just need to know if I have enough.
Yeah.
And they're wanting to retire in 18 months, and they're trying to say, have I done the right things? So, some way to alleviate a lot of that stress is just start 10 years ago, or just meet with somebody and be like, hey, look, this is what I want to do.
All right. So you had mentioned glide path. Can you kind of go into that? What is that?
So glide path is the terminology they use. And when I say they use, I mean the fund companies, the people that built these and designed these target date life cycle funds. So the glide path is the boundaries when it goes from 80-20 to 75-25. Okay. Like the glide path, because these are all predetermined. We already know when these adjustments are going to happen, and they'll tell you it's in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. But they'll have a picture that shows you when that happens, and when you get to those predetermined boundary markers, that's when it just automatically says, okay, now we're 70-30, and then 5 or 10 years later, we're at 65-35 now. And so by looking at those whether you have a to target date fund or a through target date fund, because if 2065 is your boundary marker when you say that's when I'd like to retire, and it hits 2065 and it flatlines and it goes to, it plateaus. Cannot think of that word. When it plateaus, and then you're like, okay, I'm now at 50-50 or 40-60 or whatever that is for the rest of my investment life. That that in advance, and then hey, this is a to fund versus a through fund. And so the glide path is just a general term for that predetermined path of the asset allocation, when it changes, what it changes to, those type of things.
Well, thanks, Brad. I think this has been very helpful. Hopefully viewers think so as well.
I hope so.
Anything else that you want to cover or talk about?
No, I just think in general, I think you touched on it a second ago, I recommend you start working with a financial professional as early as you possibly can. I think the longer you have those relationships, I think the more comfortable you are with divulging information to them, which allows them to make a more detailed, accurate plan. So as you build those relationships over 10, 15, 20 years, right, it's, hey, listen, this is what I'm thinking about doing. What happens to my plan if I do this? That some people, think that, hey, I'm just gonna wing it, And I mean, there has to be a lot of extra stress that's not needed.
Right, absolutely.
To when you start thinking about, well, do I have enough? Is it going to be enough, or do I have to work until I'm not capable of working anymore? So just knowing that and, establishing that relationship, I just highly recommend that as early as you possibly can do that. Again, thanks everybody for watching the video. Again, I'm going to, ask that you go to our YouTube channel. It's Core Vision Financial Group on YouTube. Like and subscribe to our videos. I appreciate it. If you have questions, comments, please feel free to reach out. You can email us. Our contact information will be at the end. Again, thank you for taking the time to watch. Appreciate it.